They truly believed. Their tanks could not be stopped. The Type 95 Hago had carved its legend across battlefields that stretched from the frozen steppes of Mongolia to the steaming jungles of Southeast Asia, against Chinese armies, against Soviet steel at Khalkhin Gol, through the lightning conquest of Malaya and the crushing victories in the Philippines. To the Japanese crews who commanded these machines, the Hago wasn't merely a weapon. It was proof of their nation's engineering genius. Swift as the wind, efficient beyond measure, utterly unstoppable, the jungle became their empire. And the Hago wore the crown. But war possesses a merciless talent for destroying beautiful lies. What started as unshakable confidence would soon collapse into devastating truth, a truth written in burning diesel, twisted metal, and the relentless thunder of American 50 caliber machine guns. The Hago's journey didn't begin at Saipan, where it would meet its fate. No. It began in the heady optimism of 1933, when Japan's military leaders gazed at their armored forces and saw something troubling. The Imperial Japanese Army viewed itself as a thoroughly modern fighting force, yet their tanks told a different story. The Type 89 medium tank, once their greatest pride, could barely manage 15 miles per hour. It was a machine built for yesterday's war, perfect for plodding alongside infantry but painfully inadequate for the rapid, mechanized warfare Japan's generals now envisioned. So Japanese engineers received their mandate: create something revolutionary. Design a light tank that could race alongside motorized infantry. Something fast, dependable, and deadly. Mitsubishi Heavy Industries accepted the challenge. Leading the project was Tomio Hara, a soft-spoken engineering genius who had already shaped Japan's earlier armored vehicles. His breakthrough was elegantly simple yet remarkably effective. A bell crank suspension system that would define Japanese tank design for the next decade. By 1934, the prototype emerged from the factory floor. It was compact, lightweight, and shockingly fast, capable of 45 kilometers per hour on paved roads, 30 across broken terrain. Military observers were absolutely thrilled. The tank possessed cat-like agility, could pivot almost in place, and seemed perfectly engineered for the mountains of China and the plains of Manchuria. Its six-cylinder air-cooled diesel engine delivered reliability and operational range that many Western tanks could only dream of achieving. Yet even in those early days of triumph, buried deep within its design lurked the fatal flaw that would eventually destroy it. Its armor measured just 12 millimeters at its thickest point, designed exclusively to defeat rifle and machine gun fire. Against genuine anti-tank weapons, it was nothing more than a steel coffin waiting for its moment. But the army adored it anyway. They designated it the Type 95. Named after the imperial year 2595 on the Japanese calendar. Production roared to life in 1936, and soon these diminutive tanks spread like wildfire across Asia. Standing barely 7 feet tall and weighing just over 7 tons, the Hago was actually smaller than most military trucks. Inside, the three-man crew endured suffocating, claustrophobic conditions. The driver sat up front, peering through a narrow vision slit. A machine gunner crouched beside him, and the commander shouldered an impossible burden. Aiming the main gun, loading shells, firing, commanding the crew, and sometimes even operating the radio. All of it, simultaneously. It was a tiny, sweltering world of steel plates and human sweat. But in China it worked brilliantly. The Hago proved utterly dominant against infantry forces lacking proper anti-tank weapons. Its 37mm cannon and twin machine guns carved through Chinese defensive positions like a hot blade through silk. Enemy fortifications crumbled before its speed and firepower. Japanese tank crews grew confident, then overconfident, then dangerously certain of their invincibility. That dangerous certainty faced its first brutal test at Khalkhin Gol in 1939, on the windswept, dusty steppes of Mongolia. There, Japanese tankers encountered the Soviet Union's BT series tanks, machines that were faster, more heavily armored, and armed with devastating 45mm guns. For the first time in combat, the Hago's paper-thin armor offered no protection whatsoever. Soviet shells punched clean through Japanese tanks as if the steel wasn't even there. Dozens of Hagos erupted in flames across the barren landscape. The battle ended in humiliating defeat, but instead of fundamentally redesigning their tanks, Japan's military leadership chose to believe Khalkhin Gol was merely an aberration, a statistical anomaly, an exception to the rule. 2 years later, that belief seemed spectacularly vindicated. When Japan launched its massive offensive across the Pacific in late 1941, the Hargo was everywhere. In Malaya, these nimble tanks rolled victoriously down narrow jungle roads that British commanders had confidently declared impassable to armor. In the Philippines, they swept aside unprepared and outgunned defenders with shocking ease. Even in their first confrontations against American M3 Stuart light tanks, the Japanese held their own remarkably well. Victories came fast and fierce, and faith in the Hargo was spectacularly reborn. Then came Saipan. June 1944. The Americans were coming, 20,000 United States Marines storming ashore beneath an absolutely apocalyptic rain of naval shells. Saipan represented Japan's critical shield, the final barrier preventing American B-29 Superfortress bombers from reaching Tokyo itself. The Imperial Army threw everything it possessed into the island's defense, including Colonel Takeshi Goto's 9th Tank Regiment, 44 tanks representing a mixture of Hargos and the slightly larger Type 97 Chiha medium tanks. The night of June 16th began quietly, almost peacefully. Then the ground began trembling. Japanese tank engines coughed and roared to life across the darkness. The regiment moved out, a column of steel advancing purposefully toward the American defensive lines. The crews were supremely confident. They had trained their entire military careers for precisely this moment. Marine sentries positioned along the perimeter heard the sound first, that deep, distinctive rumble of diesel engines growing steadily louder. Men shouted frantic warnings through the darkness. Machine gun teams scrambled desperately into firing positions. American tankers climbed hurriedly into their Sherman tanks. The tropical air grew thick, heavy electric with tension. At exactly 3:30 a.m., the Japanese attack exploded forward. 44 tanks charged through the pitch-black night toward Marine positions. To the American defenders, it was absolutely terrifying. Black silhouettes moving fast through the darkness, engines roaring like angry dragons, muzzle flashes erupting from their turrets. Marines fired illumination flares skyward. The entire battlefield lit up in ghostly, flickering light that cast dancing shadows across the jungle. And then the Marines opened fire with their Browning M250 caliber machine guns. The heavy weapons roared like thunder. The night air filled instantly with glowing tracer rounds, each red-orange streak tearing through the darkness, and then incredibly impossibly punching straight through the Japanese tanks themselves. The Marines had fully expected their armor-piercing rounds to ricochet harmlessly off enemy armor. But they didn't bounce. They penetrated, clean through one side straight through the cramped interior, exploding out the opposite side. Japanese crews inside their tanks were utterly horrified. Sparks erupted violently inside the claustrophobic interiors. Bullets sliced effortlessly through steel walls, through human flesh, through vital engine components. Tanks stopped dead in their tracks, their diesel engines hemorrhaging thick black smoke. One by one, they began burning. To the Japanese tankers, it was absolutely unthinkable, inconceivable. Machine guns, simple infantry support weapons, were killing their tanks. Their armor, their protection, their technological pride was completely worthless. A captured Japanese officer later admitted under interrogation that he genuinely believed the Americans had somehow invented a secret superweapon. He flatly refused to accept that ordinary machine guns could possibly achieve such devastating results. But the Browning M2 was far from ordinary. Its armor-piercing ammunition could penetrate 23 millimeters of hardened steel at 200 meters, nearly double the Hargo's thickest armor plating. The mathematics were absolutely merciless. As the 50 caliber machine guns systematically shredded Japanese tanks, the Marines' M4 Sherman tanks rumbled forward through the chaos. The contrast was devastating. Compared to the Hargo's meager 7 tons, the Sherman weighed a crushing 30 tons. It mounted a powerful 75mm gun, a weapon fully capable of destroying a Hargo from over a mile away, before the Japanese tank could even get within effective firing range. The Japanese crews fought back desperately, but their 37mm shells bounced harmlessly off the Sherman's thick, intelligently angled armor like pebbles against a fortress wall. The counterattack dissolved rapidly into absolute chaos. Burning tanks illuminated the night like funeral pyres. Infantry soldiers who had been riding atop the tank hulls jumped off frantically and charged forward on foot, only to be cut down mercilessly by concentrated machine gun fire. Some Marines were positioned so close that enemy tanks rolled directly over their foxholes. They waited, held their breath, then crawled out behind the passing vehicles and attacked from the rear with grenades, satchel charges, and portable flamethrowers. By dawn, 31 Japanese tanks lay destroyed and smoldering across the battlefield. The 9th Tank Regiment had ceased to exist. For the Marines, the victory was absolute and total. For Japan, it was a revelation that shattered everything they believed. In the cold, harsh light of morning, Marines walked slowly among the smoking wrecks. The tanks were riddled with holes, neat, perfectly round entry wounds where 50 caliber rounds had punched effortlessly through the steel. You could literally trace the bullets' trajectory straight through the armor across the cramped, blood-stained interiors out through the opposite side. The mighty Type 95 Hargo, once celebrated as the spearhead of Japan's armored might, was now nothing more than twisted scrap metal littering a tropical beach. That morning on Saipan fundamentally changed how American forces viewed Japanese tanks forever. From that day forward, Marines knew with absolute certainty that a 50 caliber machine gun could kill a Hargo. No more fear, no more panic, just overwhelming firepower and supreme confidence. The Japanese, however, faced a far harsher truth. Their tanks weren't merely outclassed by a generation or two. They were completely, hopelessly obsolete. Their unshakable faith in their machines had been tragically misplaced. The Empire's industrial capacity simply couldn't match America's overwhelming production capability. While Japan had laboriously built just over 2,000 Hargos during the entire war, the United States was manufacturing hundreds of Sherman tanks every single month. In Detroit, the Chrysler tank arsenal turned out nearly 100 Shermans in a single month, more tanks than Japan could produce in an entire year. Factories worked around the clock, day and night, powered by workers from every conceivable background, including thousands upon thousands of women who took up welding torches and assembly jobs that men had left behind. America's industrial might was genuinely unstoppable. By 1945, over 49,000 Sherman tanks had rolled off American assembly lines. Japan's total tank production across the entire war barely reached a fraction of that staggering number. Even their improved models, the Type 3 Chi-Nu and Type 4 Chi-2, never reached the front lines in meaningful numbers. They were too few, produced too late, and kept in reserve for the anticipated defense of the Japanese home islands that never came. So as the war ground relentlessly onward, Japanese tanks were buried deep in sand, dug carefully into caves, converted into stationary pillboxes, because moving them in the open meant absolutely certain death. On Iwo Jima, Colonel Tokiichi Nishi's precious tanks were buried up to their turrets, tragically reduced to immobile bunkers in volcanic ash. Even then, they burned under American flamethrowers and explosive charges. On Okinawa, the Japanese launched one final, desperate armored counterattack. 27 tanks rolled out courageously against 800 American Shermans supported by overwhelming artillery. It was over almost before it began. American guns tore through them systematically in a matter of hours. By the war's end, the Type 95 Hargo had become a relic, a ghost from an earlier, more innocent age. Once a powerful symbol of Japan's rising technological prowess and military strength, it became instead a grim monument to the nation's industrial decline and strategic miscalculation. The Battle of Saipan wasn't merely the death of a tank design. It was the death of an entire philosophy. The comforting belief that courage, fighting spirit, and warrior determination alone could somehow overcome superior technology and overwhelming material advantage. In the jungles of Malaya and the cities of China, that beautiful belief had held true. Japanese tankers had fought with skill and bravery, and their Hargos had delivered victory after victory. But on the beaches of Saipan, against the crushing might of American industrial power, that belief died in fire and twisted steel, and in the profound silence that followed the battle. Among the smoking wrecks and shattered armor plates, the men who once believed their tanks were genuinely invincible learned a devastating truth written in the very metal surrounding them: that bravery without adequate strength is simply sacrifice. The Hargo had been a magnificent machine for its time. Its crews had been brave, skilled, and utterly dedicated. But dedication cannot stop armor-piercing bullets. Courage cannot defeat superior firepower. And belief, no matter how strong, cannot change the fundamental mathematics of war. The Type 95 Hargo's story is ultimately a tragedy, not of cowardice or incompetence, but of men and machines caught between what was needed and what could be provided. It remains a powerful reminder that in modern warfare, industrial capacity matters, technology matters, and sometimes courage alone is simply not enough.